I'm sure I will.
Well, good morning, everybody. Is this working? Good morning. I'm Will Marshall. I want to welcome you all to Progressive Policy Institute. Thank you for joining us today for this forum on ESSA, Every Child Succeeds Act, the next iteration of the federal government's policies having to do with improving the quality of education in our public schools. And today we're releasing a wonderful report by David Osborne, Creating Measurement and Accountability Systems for 21st Century Schools, and that's our topic today. I wanted to open with a little bit of history. I hope you will indulge me, but PPI has been working on this issue for quite a while, and back in the late 90s, when Andy Rotherham was here, fresh from a stint at as President Clinton's top economic advisor, he developed a policy blueprint for reforming Title I ESSA reform to try to push it in a direction of greater accountability. And that bill, that was turned into a bill which a bunch of Democrats supported, 13 of them, and I guess they introduced it in 1999. Led by Joe Lieberman, and you know, this was an attempt to really kind of revolutionize federal policy, Title I policy, and that proposal, which then became a bill, included a 50% increase in ESSA funding for states. It targeted the money a lot more in a more focused way on high poverty schools. It also consolidated lots of programs, over 20 ESSA programs, into, I think it was 3 broad funding streams. This became the 3 R's Act, if anybody remembers that, in the late 90s, it was up for a vote in 2000, got 13 Democratic votes, not 1 Republican vote, and was something seen as coming from outside of the educational establishment. You know, it didn't go through the help committee, the education committees, or it didn't get much support there, or much love there. But it did, I think, offer a kind of a third way at that time, past the debate between the right that was very much focused on sort of block granting the money to the states and vouchers, and the Democrats, who were always for more spending, but not for much stronger accountability measures. So, as I said, there was a vote on that in 2000. It failed, but these ideas, some of them anyway, migrated through to the new administration of George W. Bush, who was elected later that year, and through the medium of a good friend of ours from Dallas, Sandy Kress, a Democrat and a school reformer in Dallas, who is also a friend of the new president's, and made sure that some of that architecture found its way into No Child Left Behind. And what didn't make it in there was the consolidation of programs, which is too bad, but what did make it in there was a real, I'd say the most serious effort to date to link federal investment, federal spending on public education, on K through 12 schools, to serious accountability. Now, I think we all know that as a first stab, there were limitations, shortcomings in that approach, in the No Child Left Behind approach, and we'll talk about that today. And now with this new ESSA approach, we have an opportunity to build on the framework, to improve it, to apply more sophisticated measures, and to think again about the challenge of holding schools and states accountable to improving education, particularly for low-income kids, and particularly in urban areas. So that's the topic. David Osborne, who runs PPI's Reinventing Schools project, which I hope you all are aware of. It's a wonderful project that's chronicling the emergence of a new governing and organizing principle for public education that is coming out of these charter school experiments in places like New Orleans and Washington, Denver, and elsewhere. But David has really offered in this new report a creative framework to help state policymakers think about accountability, well, about both sides, about measurement and accountability. What should be measured, and which of those measures should there be real consequences attached to it, which is, I think, a pretty difficult question. And David has, I think, put together a really canny framework for state policymakers who are now wrestling with this challenge of figuring out the rules and how to execute this new federal approach. So that's what we're here to talk about. I want to thank, in addition to David, Michael Petrilli and Claire Voorhees and Laura Jimenez, who are going to join us after David presents summarizes his report. We're going to bring the panel up here and then have a discussion, get some other perspectives on it. So thank you all for joining us again. Without further ado, David, over to you.
Thank you, Will. Good morning. Thanks for being here, everybody. So Will mentioned our project, Reinventing America's Schools. The purpose really is to get people to stop thinking about charter schools as this either nice or evil innovation around the edges of the public school system and realize that, in fact, they're introducing a new way of organizing the public school system. And it's a way of organizing that actually works better in the 21st century. So I've been writing about places like New Orleans, where 93% of the kids are in charters, and it's the fastest improving city in the country that I know of. I mean, I certainly don't have data on every city in the country, but I've never met anybody who has been able to say this city's improving faster than New Orleans. And Washington, D.C., where you essentially have two systems side by side. 45% of the kids are in charters. Pretty well-run system that not only performs better than the traditional system, but is improving faster. So that's kind of our purpose. And the problem is you're not going to get to 21st century schools if you're using 20th century standards, if you're holding them accountable to 20th century standards. And fortunately, we now have a new federal legislation that sort of opens the door a little bit to the states. There are still some requirements. As most of you probably know, states have to include math and English language arts scores, graduation rates, and the progress of their English language learners in their measurement and accountability systems, but they're free to add other measures. Those top ones in the top bullet have to have the greatest weight in the system if they have a rating system that weights different elements. But there can be other elements that have less weight. So it leaves a lot of running room to the states. And I think that's a very good thing. What I'm going to do is run through about 8 sort of pieces of advice that I have for states as they redo their systems. And as you know, they're all struggling with this. They're all in the midst of it right now. So the first is that we need accountability systems that treat different schools differently. Under NCLB, which was well-intended, wonderful impulse toward accountability for every school, particularly schools with low-income kids, but it used pretty blunt instruments, achievement levels on math and reading, and a lot of you are familiar with the flaws in that. Today, we've got evolving systems in which schools, we're creating different schools for kids with different needs. And that's a huge plus. But our accountability systems are pushing all the schools toward being roughly the same. Now, I think we still do need minimum standards. I mean, we don't want to be putting our public dollars into schools where kids are not learning to read, not learning math, and not learning some of the other things that are pretty basic in this society. But a minimum doesn't get you very far. And it doesn't affect all the schools. There's lots I mean, my children went to public schools that paid almost no attention to the standards because almost all their kids were above the standards. So there was no motivation, that accountability system really had no impact on those schools. And, I think everyone understands that if you've got a school that's for kids coming out of the criminal justice system, or you've got a school that's for pregnant teenagers, or you've got a school that's career and technical education, you probably don't want to hold those schools to exactly the same standards that you're holding the average high school to. So how do we do that? Well, I think we need to learn from the charter sector. A charter is a performance agreement, typically for 5 years, but it varies around the country, between an authorizer and a school. And it lays out, here are our goals, here's what we want to accomplish, here's how we're going to measure them, and here are the consequences if we fail. And that model has turned out, where it's used faithfully, and there are states where it is not used faithfully, but where it is used faithfully, that model has turned out to be pretty powerful in terms of improving results. So I believe that states ought to encourage, not require, but encourage districts to do the same with their traditional public schools. Now, why not require it? Because when you're required to do something by the feds or the state, most schools comply, but complying means jumping through hoops. It doesn't mean they're actually taking it seriously and trying to make it actually improve things in the real world. So you have to be careful, but incentivize, encourage, maybe create financial incentives to do this. If we've got a performance agreement negotiated between a district and a school, you're going to have more buy-in to those goals by that school than simply minimum standards imposed by the state. You're also going to motivate every school. You're going to motivate the schools that are far above the minimums because they're going to have their own performance goals and their own consequences, positive and negative, if they succeed or fail. And finally, you're going to encourage far more innovation because when we apply the same standard to every school, we discourage innovation. I'll tell you a little story about a friend of ours. Used to be very involved in PPI and the Democratic Leadership Council back in the day, named Doug Ross, who ran for governor in '96 maybe in Michigan, lost in the primaries, then decided, well, forget it, I'm going to go do something in the real world. And he created a charter school in inner city Detroit, 100% African American, low income. Then he created another, then he created another. He created about 6 schools. And his model was built primarily or inspired by the Met School, which is a big picture learning school in Providence, Rhode Island, which focuses heavily on hands-on learning and puts its kids into internships in businesses and nonprofits and government offices. So in Doug's high school, every student spent 2 days a week in an internship. Now, these are African-American kids from neighborhoods where they didn't know anybody who ever went to college. And now they're working in an office with people who look like them, a little older, but look like them and have nice houses and cars and lives and jobs because they went to college. And a light bulb goes off, and you finally get motivation. And some of these kids discover that they can do things that people value. And you know, the gift to self-esteem is huge. So it was incredibly important and incredibly effective. And when the state of Michigan imposed standards on every public school, guess what he had to do? He had to cut it back to half a day a week because they had all this material to cover that was going to be on the state tests, and that's how they were held accountable. So having the same system for every school drives you away from innovation. What I'm saying is let's have 2 systems. Let's have, yes, we want a system of minimums for every school, but let's tailor things a little more, and let's have performance agreements between authorizers or districts and individual schools, or groups of schools if they use the same model. Second point, we should make accountability real by replacing failed schools with proven models. You know, this is a long discussion, but NCLB had some teeth, but they were fairly weak. ESSA has almost none. And states are going to be able to basically shall we say, tolerate failure a lot more if they want to. That would be a huge mistake. It turns out that real accountability of the kind that can lead to closure and replacement if your kids are not learning is probably the most powerful tool we have to improve public education. You know, when all the adults in a school know that if the kids aren't learning, all of them are going to lose their jobs at some point in the future, it changes everything, obviously. I mean, people work together to try to overcome whatever obstacles are preventing learning in that building. And just the very act of weeding out every year your lowest performers and replacing them with schools created by high performers increases the quality of your pool of the schools every year. So it's a very powerful method. It's been proven, I think, in the charter world. If you look, how many of you are familiar with the Credo studies from Stanford? Yeah, if you look at those studies and ask yourself, well, why is this state weak and this state strong? The weak states are the ones that where authorizers don't close failing charter schools. The correspondence is very direct and it's fairly clear. Third point, accountability is not the same as measurement. There's lots of things we need to measure because the information is important to someone. It might be important to parents who are making choices. It might be important to district officials who are trying to figure out where to invest their money. You know, things like teacher-student ratios, number of advanced placement courses. I mean, that kind of information is very important to parents when they're making choices. But that doesn't mean we should be holding schools accountable for that. We should measure, states should require measurement of more than they hold schools accountable for. We should hold schools accountable for outcomes that really matter in students' future lives. That's what we care about. And we should give schools the freedom to figure out what methods work for their students, rather than holding them accountable for using method A, B, or C, like advanced placement courses. You know, if we include things like the number of advanced placement courses, the number of dual credit college courses, and so on in accountability standards, what we're saying to Doug Ross's school is, you should be doing this, not your internships. And that's the wrong message, because that's not what his students need necessarily. The formula that works is accountability plus autonomy. And that's what we should be looking for. Now, there are a lot of popular measures that our states are putting into their systems that it turns out aren't a very good idea for one reason or another. Student attendance. Obviously, that should be in an accountability system, right? The problem is, who takes student attendance? Who records it? The school. It's the easiest thing there is to cheat on. And schools have cheated on it in the past. And the only way you could avoid that is have another organization come in and take attendance every day, which is probably not going to happen. So it's one of those measures that, while important, can be so easily gamed that we probably shouldn't use it for accountability. Student demand is another one. For most schools, that's a really important indicator. But what if you're running a school for teenage mothers and your district figures out, or your city figures out, how to drive teenage pregnancy down, and your demand falls? Is that failure? No, that's success. The same for a school for kids coming out of the criminal justice system. So if we applied this standard to every school, we'd be doing a disservice to a few of them. So if you have a dual system, you can put student demand into your performance agreement with a lot of schools where it really is appropriate, but not put it in where it's not appropriate. Student retention is another. It's very common to say, okay, that's really important. Are you keeping your kids? Yes?
Is it okay to ask questions now? Sorry. Or do you want, I can hold it?
Why don't you hold it? Thank you. But, you know, if you go out and you visit really excellent schools, you learn that one reason they're excellent is because they're really demanding. And you also learn that they lose a certain, particularly in high school, they lose a certain percentage of their kids because there's another school down the road that is not demanding. And some of the kids decide they don't like doing this much homework, and they could graduate with good grades with ease at this other school, so they leave. Do we want to punish those schools and give them incentives to be less demanding? No, that would not be smart. So let's not hold them accountable to that standard. Discipline rates is another one that's getting all kinds of press right now. And I certainly agree that there are too many expulsions and suspensions from public schools of all types, and that we should be developing other methods like restorative justice, which is a very powerful method. But how can any state Department of Education establish a standard that should apply to every school on numbers of suspensions and expulsions? Would that work? No. It would create huge problems. I have a daughter who taught for 3 years at a fairly bad charter school in New Orleans. And it was bad because the dean who was in charge of discipline didn't enforce it. They had policies, but the teachers, a fight would break out in class, or a kid would act up and disturb the class, and the teacher would send them to the discipline dean. And rather than saying, okay, you get an in-school suspension, or you get an out-of-school suspension, or whatever their policies called for, they'd yell at them for 10 minutes and send them back to class, which completely undermined the teaching force, destroyed morale. So is the solution there? Fewer suspensions? Well, not necessarily. We have to leave those decisions up to the people who run schools, and then we have to hold those people accountable for the quality of the schools. And finally, college-level courses is a very popular one. But again, if you're Doug Ross in inner-city Detroit, are AP classes and dual credit college classes the best strategy for your students? You should make that decision, not the state, because they're not the best strategy for every student. Fourth point, test scores are important, okay? I'm not one of those who says we shouldn't be testing. We need to know if kids can read. We need to know if they can do math. And if they can't, and a lot of them in the school can't, we need to replace that school with a better school. But we rely on them too heavily. The Center for American Progress, Laura's organization, came out with a report earlier this year which has these numbers. Basically, we're relying on test scores for 70 to 90% of the weight in accountability systems currently. I think that's too much. It's too much because schools tend to bend their teaching toward tests, toward memorization. Test scores bounce around a lot from year to year. Some people, as we all know, just don't test well. Sometimes it's personality, sometimes it's dyslexia or some other disability, sometimes it's that they're English language learners. And until they get into, say, high school, their language deficits affect their test scores profoundly. And when we weight test too heavily, we push schools away from what we call deeper learning, from learning that engages students more, gets them thinking, helps develop their critical faculties. Now, the Common Core test, aligned tests are better on that score, but they can't, no written test can go all the way in terms of encouraging that deeper learning. And finally, we don't want to discourage innovation. We don't want to discourage creating unique schools for unique kinds of students. You know, right now, in the charter world, the big thing that's missing, in my opinion, is career and technical education. And one of the reasons is because all charter operators know that if they create a career in tech high school, it's going to really struggle on the accountability standards on test scores. So they don't do it. I've had charter operators tell me that. So, fifth point. When we do use test scores, we should give more weight to academic growth than to achievement levels. Now, I bet probably all of you are familiar with this argument. If you just use achievement levels, what percent are proficient? You're essentially making it impossible for schools full of low-income kids. And that's why those are the schools that are failing, according to our current systems. And that is completely unfair. It's completely discouraging to the people who work in those schools. So there have been waivers, of course, but studies show that the majority of states are still giving more weight to status, academic status or proficiency, than they are to growth. And it should be the opposite. They should give more weight to growth. And when they use test scores, they should focus on more than the proficiency level. As you know, probably NCLB said, okay, you have to set a cut score, whether you call it basic or proficient or something else, and then measure and hold schools accountable based on what percent of kids reach that cut score. So what happened? Schools that were struggling focused their energy on the kids just below the cut score. They're called the bubble kids. And the kids who were above proficient, oh, they were fine. And the kids who were way below, well, we can't help them. So we kind of skewed the energy of schools. It was a blunt instrument. It was really kind of a dumb way to do it. So we should either use average scores or a proficiency index, which Michael may talk about. Fordham has been really big on pushing this in a great way. And when we use growth measures, we shouldn't use growth to proficiency, which some states use. We should use growth in general, because if you're above proficient, your growth should matter. It should be important to schools. Seventh point, let's talk about other measures than test scores that we should use. High school graduation rates, that's an easy one. That's in the ESSA Act. And I think it's a no-brainer. Even though, you know, high school graduation doesn't always mean that you're ready for what comes next, but still, it is something that is an important marker. And then college entrance and persistence rates are extremely important. I think you all probably wouldn't debate that, but just in case, this shows you what's happening to high school dropouts and their incomes. They're below where they were in 1963 in real terms. High school graduates, just above. Some college, bachelor's degree, and a higher degree than that. That's for males, but the graph for females looks about the same. So it's indisputable that in our economy, a college degree is really worth something. So, but that doesn't mean every student should go to college. There are some students who don't want to go to college, don't really belong in college, and they need jobs, training, they need skills to thrive in this economy, but they aren't necessarily the skills that they'll get in college. So we should be measuring what percentage of graduates are either in training or in employment, full-time employment. The next one is really important. How many of you know about England's system of school inspections? Raise your hands. Okay, so most of you don't. I think it is 3 years, though don't hold me to it, a team of experts who are typically former teachers and principals visits each school in the UK for 2 or 3 days and does a variety of meetings, looks at a lot of data, looks at surveys of parents and students, observes teachers teaching, and then writes a report and rates the school on a whole series of qualitative measures. And they have a four-level rating system, outstanding down to inadequate. And that system seems to have been very effective. New York City basically adopted it for its schools. Massachusetts uses it for charter schools. Indianapolis uses it for charter schools, and other places use it for charter schools. Even KIPP, the big charter network, has used it for its own schools. I think that it gives insight into a lot of the things that are important in a school, like culture and school climate. money on accreditation teeth at all. Schools are almost never refused accreditation. And that process in many regions focuses more on facilities than anything else. So we're already investing a lot. Maybe we should invest it more intelligently. And then finally, student engagement is really important. And I'd love to say that you can measure this by student surveys, but I'm going to say parent surveys, and I'll tell you why in a minute. My final point, there are some really important measures that for one reason or another aren't ready for prime time. They need more research. They have potential flaws. We can't really guarantee that they'll work. So student surveys is the second one. I'll take that first since I just talked about it. I'm a huge believer in customer surveys as a way to measure quality of anything. And students are the most important customer of public schools. And if you survey them and they answer honestly, the information is invaluable. And I believe that states should require this. But should they put it in the accountability system? There are a couple of problems. Adults sometimes can influence student answers. And secondly, students sometimes punish teachers who are more demanding. If you talk to college professors who usually get rated by, these kinds of evaluations are very common in college. You talk to the college professors and they'll talk to you about this. They'll say this generation doesn't want to do any work, and when you require too much work, they rate you negatively. So there is research going on. There are places that are using student surveys. And we just need the federal government and states to invest in research to try to figure out how to do this in a way that doesn't have those flaws. Second one, qualitative assessments of student work, like portfolios, performances, performance tasks, oral presentations. There are places where this is going on. New Hampshire has a waiver to use these kinds of assessments, and they're in, I think, their third year of developing their system, though don't hold me to that. The problem is, if you've got thousands of schools, can you be sure that essentially a subjective assessment of a performance or a portfolio is the same for all those schools? Now, there are countries that do it, and they have systems where they train the raters, they use rubrics, and they double check to make sure that they're roughly the same. Well, we need research to prove that we can do that statewide in this country and make it work and make it fair and objective and reliable, I think, before we start holding schools accountable. The next one, assessment of non-cognitive skills. This is getting a lot of discussion these days. Things like self-control, persistence, conscientiousness, they're obviously critical to future success. The research on that is indisputable. But the only way to measure them in a way we can afford is surveying students and teachers. And that gets into the problems I talked about already with student surveys, plus another one called reference bias, where let's say you guys go to a demanding school, you do 3 hours of homework a night, you're all going to go to college, and everybody has really high standards. And you go to a school where you don't get any homework, and everybody gets A's and B's regardless. When we survey both groups and ask about things like conscientiousness, you're going to have different expectations, right? This group is going to have much lower standards and rate themselves higher than this group. So again, there's a lot of research going on this. There are districts, 6 big districts in California that are now doing this. And that's what we need. We need experiments and research and figure out how to do this in an effective way. And by the way, all of these can be used in performance agreements with schools where the school agrees that, yeah, we do want to be accountable for these non-cognitive skills, and so we will put them in as one of our goals. Okay, so what does it all add up to? This is what I would suggest a state do roughly. I mean, there's no right answer on these things, right? You know, I'm not going to quibble about this number and that number too much, but this is kind of what I would suggest to high schools. Can you all read that okay? Yeah. So the English language learners' progress toward proficiency, the law requires that, but I say make it variable, because if your school has 80% English language learners and your school has 0% English language learners, we probably shouldn't be using the same number there, right? It's really important at your school, and it's irrelevant at your school. The growth, measuring academic growth is incredibly complicated. There's all these different methods. I'm not going to go into the details. We can talk about it with questions if you like. But I believe, as far as I can understand it, and it is dense, there are some ways of measuring in which you could just use the growth measure. You don't need the achievement measure at all. And there are others where I think you need both. Very complicated question. And Mike's in the middle of a debate about this. Elementary and middle schools, you don't have the outcomes. You don't have high school graduation, college going, all of those things to look at. So I would subtract those. Otherwise, it's roughly the same. And now I'm going to give you the indicators that I would suggest for each of these. What does student outcomes mean? Academic achievement and growth, it's test scores, basically, plus industry certifications. In high schools now, some high schools are giving students programs where they can get a certification from an industry, and that's something of value. We should be giving them credit for that. I talked about the qualitative assessments, talked about student engagement and parent surveys, because I believe parents are less apt to be persuaded by teachers and principals that they should respond in a more positive way than they feel. I think most parents would probably respond pretty honestly. And then the important one, outcomes for high schools. There's a lot of things you can measure. There's high school graduation rate, and not just the 4-year rate. I think a 5 or 6 years is just as important. Some kids take that long. And we want to reward schools that are willing to invest in those kids. Some states have different quality diplomas. You can get a diploma with, if you look at the report, there are some examples. But like New York has a Regents diploma with X, Y, and Z, all kinds of honors. Extra credit for that. Percent of graduates enrolling in college. And then the percentage of those who are required to take remedial classes. Because as you know, it's very high. And that reflects on their high school. College persistence, and then non-college bound graduates, the percent employed in training or in the military. And for those who are employed full-time, income levels over 2 years after they graduate, because that's an important outcome for those kids. There's a difference between working at McDonald's and having a job where you could actually support a family. These are some of the things that I think states should require measurement of without including in their accountability system. And I'm sure there are a few others that people could come up with, but these are the ones I'm aware of. And finally, I think states should, for each of these 5 or 6 elements in an statewide accountability system, states should give a grade, and then there should be a summative grade. Now, there's big debate about that last point, and there's a debate about whether to use grades. I say if we use grades for our kids, we should have the courage to use grades for our adults who run schools. That's what parents understand best, A to F. They know what that means. We all know what that means. The law requires that schools report these outcomes for subgroups, English language learners, low-income kids, minority groups, et cetera. And the Fordham Institute has been arguing, as you'll hear, that we should add high achievers as a subgroup. I agree with that. I think that there's this question of, are you accountable for the kids who arrived halfway through the year? That different states treat differently. I think it's rather unfair to hold a school accountable for kids who arrived halfway through the year. So my personal standard would be if they arrived more than 6 weeks after school started, you don't count them that year. But, you know, again, there's no right answers. That's my stab at what is common sense. It's very important that all data used in an accountability system be audited, spot checked. Schools do cheat. We live in the real world. We've experienced this. And so we have to do what we can to catch it when it happens and discourage it for everyone. And then finally, when we publish reports on each school, they should include the stuff in the statewide accountability system, but they should also include the stuff in the school's performance agreement. Because, you know, if they're a dual language immersion school, then how they're doing at proficiency in that second language, or in both languages, is pretty important. So let's include that. All right, I've probably gone on too long, but I'm going to stop there and turn it back to Will.
Thank you very much, David. David's written a really comprehensive report that we've all study it in depth. Let me now ask our roundtable participants to come on up and get mic'd up, and I will introduce them and say first, as we're getting everybody wired up, that David's presentation reminds me of or underscores just how much more sophisticated the conversation about accountability, measurement and accountability has become since No Child was passed. And we really didn't have much in the way beyond the standardized test that, that everybody could agree on as measures that by which we'd hold schools accountable. So it's become a much richer discussion with a lot more refinement about the measuring instruments that are available to us. But as David pointed out, I think very clearly in his presentation, there are all kinds of unintended consequences and potentially perverse consequences to getting it wrong, to trying to use certain measures that seem on their face to be logical ones for determining how badly or well a school is doing in educating kids, but that could have perverse consequences that we don't want. So it's a complicated matter, and we're really fortunate today to have with us three distinguished experts on education policy from various points of the political spectrum. So let me introduce them to you. First, on my left, rarely to find him over there, is Michael Petrilli. We did that on purpose. Michael is president of Thomas Fordham Institute. I should say we've worked with Fordham productively down decades, actually, on education reform issues. Also research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution and executive editor of Education Next. He's the author of too many books to mention here. He also worked in the education department where he helped to create the Office of Innovation and Improvement. And I also want to thank Mike for correcting my mispronunciation of ESSA. It was actually ESSA, but I told him I think Southerners should get dispensation, get a license for mispronounce. But in any event, there's a typical Washington insight.
I know.
But thank
I get the jargon right.
Thanks for that correction. Then Claire Voorhees directs the K-12 reform at the Foundation for Excellence in Education. She was previously at HCM strategist, where she provided clients with strategic advice on new approaches to education reform. She worked in the White House Policy Council under President Bush, where she assisted in shaping the administration's education policies. So had a ringside seat for the No Child achievement. She began her career as a fourth grade teacher at PS 43 in the South Bronx, New York. Wow. And Laura Jimenez is Director of Standards and Accountability at the Center for American Progress. Previously, she directed the College and Career Readiness and Success Center at the American Institute for Research. And Laura was Special Assistant in the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education at the Education Department, working on K-12 programs, including Title I, ESSA, ESSA, and related
ESSA.
and related issues. Sorry, it's going to take a while. So thank you all for joining us. I think, Michael, let me start with you.
Yeah. He needs his PowerPoint.
Oh, you have a PowerPoint? Okay.
Can you?
Are we ready for that?
Yeah.
Okay.
We can keep a conversation.
Okay. Well, while they're kicking that up, there we go. Well, tell us your reaction to
Yep.
what David has said and Fordham's position on ESSA.
That's
the author.
very good. Well, first of all, it is an honor to be here at PPI. You know, for those of us on the center right, this is a very depressing time in American life. I think there will be a lot of discussions after the election, if it goes as it now appears it may go, about how some of us can do what you did 20 years ago, where you had to work on pulling the Democratic Party more towards the center and focus on solutions. That is something that may be needed in the Republican Party, some would say. And of course, give it to PPI that you put the Republicans on the left and the Democrats on the right. I like that. Always mixing things up. And for David, look, David Osborne, you know, is a real hero to us policy wonks. And his book on reinventing government had an immediate impact in the real world, in Al Gore's reinventing government stuff, in charter schools, and so many different areas around performance management. So it's great to have you back on the education beat, David.
Thanks, Mike.
This is a fantastic report. Is complicated, and I think what we see in this discussion in David's report, and now what every state in the country is wrestling with, which is how to design a new accountability system under ESSA, are all of these trade-offs, and it is super complicated. The law does set some clear requirements that you've got to look at, you know, achievement and growth and English language proficiency and other stuff. But how do you add that all together and come out with a way to rate schools that makes sense to the public, that can drive improvement, that doesn't give up on No Child Left Behind's goals around equity and achievement gaps, but also moves away from some of the perverse incentives of No Child Left Behind. David, I feel like I can show a few of my slides, but you did such a great job making the case for a lot of what we've been arguing for. At Fordham, I'll say a few things, but I think one thing that's really important to point out right now is that many of the things that David would like states to be able to do are things that in the Department of Education's initial regulations, draft regulations that came out this summer, they would not be able to do. So, for example, this question about whether we measure achievement, academic achievement, just at the proficient level, or if we can measure it at the basic level and the advanced level too. It gets kind of wonky, but it's important if you want to send signals to schools that all kids matter. Well, that doesn't look like the department's saying that's going to be allowed. In my view, they can still, change their mind on that, or a new administration could have a different policy. Likewise, with this question around do you have to smush all these different indicators together into a final grade? The Department of Ed says yes. Plenty of people on the Hill who look at the law and say that is not required. Here's why it's important. If you have a school that is showing a lot of growth, but is not yet getting all kids to proficiency, then it might get an A for growth and a D for proficiency. I have a particular school in mind. Right now in Ohio, those are the grades given to the KIPP Columbus School, a school that we oversee as a charter school authorizer. It's a phenomenal school, like most KIPP schools are. It is like an A+ for growth in terms of how much progress kids are making over the course of the year. But all the kids they serve are low income. They start out way behind. Ohio finally has raised the bar on what it takes to be proficient. And their kids are not yet getting to that very high bar. And so they get a D for achievement. Now, guess what? How many urban schools in Ohio get a D or F on achievement? 94%. Okay, so if you have a system that basically says, look, it's going to be impossible for you to get an A if you serve a lot of poor kids, that's a system that's not going to be credible, and it's going to be very demoralizing. Now, should we smush that A and that D together and say, okay, well, that KIPP school is a B-? I don't know. I think you actually lose information that way. It would be more helpful maybe to have two separate grades. But the Department of Education is right now saying that we got to smush things together. Just very briefly on with a few of the things that Will said. We at Fordham are particularly interested in high achievers, especially high achieving low income kids. We think these are the kids that have been have really been overlooked in the No Child Left Behind world, because if you're at a high poverty school, those schools have been under pressure to pay attention to their low-performing kids. But what about those kids who they are growing up in poverty? They are living in tough neighborhoods, but lo and behold, they're showing a lot of academic promise. They are the kids who are the best shot at making it to college, making it to selective colleges, making it into our professions and our politics and being, in that leadership class, et cetera, et cetera. And yet their schools have been told for all these years that these kids don't matter because, like David said, they're already proficient. So we would like states to be able to look at, again, measuring achievement at that advanced level as well as proficient, a big focus on growth, and pulling them out as a separate subgroup. And some states agree. Right now, 14 states, this is for elementary and middle schools, have some kind of proficiency index where they look at achievement at these multiple levels. Again, right now, if the current draft regulations go through, those states would not be allowed to do that anymore. I think that's crazy, okay? What this is showing is that the different kind of growth models that are out there, it is true that most states now have some way to measure growth. The problem is they don't count for very much. What this is showing is that overwhelmingly, most states, even under the waivers, under ESSA, have a very tiny percentage going to growth. And that means most of what's being measured is still achievement. That means that most high poverty schools are still going to look like failing schools because even if they're making a lot of growth, it just isn't counting enough. We think it should count a lot more. And then finally, this idea of pulling out the high achievers as a separate subgroup. 5 states do that. We'd like to see more states do that today. So, there's only a handful of states that are doing this really well. We'd like to see a lot more than that. But more than anything, let's make sure we are very aware of the decisions that get made. Again, sometimes the good impulse is if the outcome is that all high poverty schools get labeled as failing no matter what, those are systems that just don't make sense. Okay? So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Mike. I appreciate that. So still a risk that we're going to misuse the measurement system to stigmatize schools that actually could be doing a very good job. Claire, give us your perspective, please, from somebody, I guess, who was there, present at the creation of No Child, and now, now we're moving on to what we hope is a kind of a 2.0 version that's better. But what do you think about what you've heard so far?
Right. Well, I want to speak today more in the current role at the Foundation for Excellence in Education, where we're a policy and advocacy organization where we work really with states. Our focus is less federal and more really supporting states on the front lines with some advocacy team members who are regionally based and then some policy experts who help a variety of states. In fact, we've helped between 18 and 20 states actually develop their accountability systems down to these nitty-gritty calculations. We have experts for that if you're in the market. And so I think today, as a former teacher and a parent of 2 toddlers, I'll do a criticism sandwich. Is my favorite way of start with. It's starting what you're like, and I do think. I mean, I would say you agree with. The vast majority of your points about the need to move away from the era of No Child Left Behind, where we focused all too much on proficiency for math and reading, and that was just about it. Our concern, based on our frontline work on the states, is for an overcorrection. Is that we go from a focus on proficiency, and that didn't work, and then we go the opposite direction, and then it's kind of no holds bar. All these different indicators in, whether they're valid and reliable or not, and that we're just going to create systems that are so complex, so filled with indicators, that they're not clear for parents, they hide the ball, and it ends up just being kind of smushy is the technical term. I will say technical because Chad Alderman used it, therefore it is technical. So that's really the balance here. So, excited about, particularly I think starting with the stuff we really agree with is just the role of measurement or reporting here, and that not that just that it's another option, but we see this reporting as part and parcel of the accountability system. And that it shouldn't just be this afterthought of, oh, that indicator sort of matters, so let's put it on let's report it to parents. But in order for that, it should be seen both as your school accountability calculation. There's certain indicators that should fit in there, and then there's certain that should be on the report card. The problem right now is, as a lot of organizations have found out when they've looked at it, is these federally required school report cards are a complete disaster. I challenge you, any policy wonk in the audience, to go find how Lincoln Elementary School in Nebraska is doing. You will probably take you 10, 15 minutes to find the report card that's federally required, and you probably won't be able to understand it once you find it. These things are a mess. States haven't invested in them. So we are in this transition to ESSA. We think it's a great opportunity for to bring reporting up to the 21st century. You don't go to a movie without going to Rotten Tomatoes and looking at their website, and yet we don't have mobile-friendly parent empowerment tools that provide school information. And so a lot of organizations are working on it, and I think it's who could be against better reporting for the most part? So a bipartisan thing that should be pressure on every state to improve how they report this information. Letter grades is something we're a huge fan of as well. That organization was founded by Governor Jeb Bush based on his Florida model, and the A through F single summative grade has had such power there, and in other states, we think it's an invaluable piece of the puzzle. I think, I know Mike disagrees with me here, but multiple grades, we're not saying parents can't understand multiple grades, but I think the power that comes with a single label, both publicly in terms of parent empowerment and in terms of the messages it sends, that's why Yelp is valuable. It doesn't say, oh, you got 4 stars for this and 3 stars for this and 2 stars. It's 3 stars, and I think that has a power in our culture that can't be overlooked. And of course, that has to be accompanied by an amazing report card that provides insight into all these data and how you're doing on growth and how you're doing on proficiency and how that sums up to a single powerful grade. And the other thing we agree wholeheartedly on is the need for real consequences. This is our current soapbox issue. There's so much energy going into this conversation on the school calculation, how we're going to identify these schools, and just not nearly enough into what the heck we're going to do once we found them. And we actually already know which ones they are, So I think that having to states to have the courage to have real consequences that we think should involve shutting down schools, opening new high-performing charters down the street. It should be a district-wide approach, and we think that choice message is going to be particularly valuable in some of the states where we work, because we work in a lot of right-leaning states, and choice is a way to get more Republicans on board to do something about education, just to be kind of political about it. It's a powerful tool because it works and because you can get some good political energy behind it, regardless of the state. That said, it's not easy to do, and we can go into that. It's a controversial thing. There's nothing harder to do than to shut down a school, no matter how poorly it's performing. Shifting a little bit to the where I think we don't quite agree with you. I think one of the fundamental issues that we have is on the need for a common set of metrics and standards for every school, and I know you said there be a kind of a bare bones or kind of two separate, like a bare bones version and then a performance agreement. And we think that the accountability system can be more than just bare bones, and it has to be based on a common set of outcomes and metrics. And I think to do otherwise, how can a parent make a choice if they're judging schools based on completely different standards or different expectations? There's also, I think, the equity issue is that it's a really slippery slope when you start saying, this school doesn't quite need to prepare its kids for college or career ready, or the alternate school model is one that's worked some places, but in Florida they ended up having to grade everyone because shenanigans. We've unfortunately working on the front lines. You see the crazy stuff the districts and schools do. Florida, they started creating alternative schools inside of schools and putting their troubled kids there. You have to think about the unintended consequences, unfortunately. We've seen way too many of them. a couple other points where I think we disagree a little bit is on the focus on outcome measures. Totally, as I said at the beginning, don't think, it certainly should not be all about test scores. But you have to remember kind of the purpose of federal and state accountability systems, which is to make sure that our students are learning. It's not to dictate what happens in classrooms or what kind of character traits. So while those things are incredibly important for every school to do, they're not the responsibility of a state or federal accountability system. And that's why we recommend to states that largely that it's in an order of fairness, and because the state, true to the purpose of an accountability system, it should focus on measurable student outcomes. And those would be test scores and graduation rates and industry certifications. But we get very nervous when you go into kind of the other, those other less academic indicators because of, can run through those because of all the different concerns about unintended consequences and validity and also just fairness to schools. To finish up is I think we disagree a bit with Mike and David a little bit on the appropriate balance between proficiency and growth. I think absolutely we've underweighted growth in the past, but I'm really a little concerned about swifting too much in the other direction and kind of forgetting about proficiency. Yes, it's fair to schools to judge them on growth, probably in a significant part, because they have to take kids where they are and try to move them, especially if they're serving underprivileged populations. But it's fair to kids to expect them all to get to proficiency. And I just don't want to forget this battle we all fought on Common Core and high standards, that there's something about proficiency, which is what it's college and career readiness, we hope, and it's the expectations of employers. And we have to be moving kids, have growth models, and weight proficiency and growth, we think probably just about balanced equally in a system so that you're moving all kids, but there is that goal, that line in the sandwich is this is where we want to get kids, and I'm afraid about an overcorrection there. I would love to get into some of the more indicators. I don't want to take too much, some of the caution that needs to be exercised around indicators, and I'd love to continue that. I'd say one point here is we've got an interesting pushback, which I think is very valid, which is that we're going out and selling everybody on this great new law and all the flexibility they have, and then I stand up and give an hour-long presentation about the requirements and why they shouldn't do any new indicators that aren't based on, And I get that, and I think that David does a good job of this, is that patience is required. Let's not kind of jump the shark, stick with what works, improve, work and study these new indicators, make sure they're ready for prime time, and maybe think about ways to innovate and different ways to test kids. There's a lot of space for innovation there without completely throwing out or moving too far away from sort of the basics of what an accountability system should be.
Thanks very much, Claire. You raised a lot of interesting issues, but one of the themes that
I don't know if that's on.
Is it?
it says it's on. One of the themes that comes through is the risk that we may be overwhelming parents with too much information. So we have too many rich ways to try to measure performance, and it'll be hard for parents to navigate that. All that information. Well, David will get a chance to respond to these points in a minute, but let me turn to Laura and say, okay, give us your perspective, please, Laura, on this ESSA bill and the sort of also what David has added to that in terms of specifics about how we might take advantage of the opportunity to create a more sophisticated set of measurements.
Great. Well, thank you all for having me here. Claire, you stole a little bit of my thunder because I think we are thinking about accountability in very similar ways. Ultimately, we have to know how well our schools are preparing our students for success in college and careers, because it is a much different world today in 2016 than when many of us were in school. Students are expected to be global citizens. The economy is a global one, not a local one. And students have to be prepared with a set of skills that frankly is different than the set of skills than perhaps we were taught intentionally in school. And accountability, the way that we're thinking about it at the Center for American Progress is much broader than a school classification system, right? Because a lot of what we've been talking about when it comes to accountability really has been limited to classifying schools as low performing, when it can be much broader than that and much more meaningful. And it can be a continuous system of measuring and improving teaching and learning. Of course, classifying schools on how well they're doing that is one component. Reporting out how well they're doing that is another component. And then another really important component is how well we're supporting our districts, our schools, our teachers, to provide interventions and supports to students that they need to reach that college and career readiness level. But I think before we can get there, states have to be really clear in what they mean by college and career ready. What is that specific definition? What are the skills? And then how do you measure it? Because then everything can flow from there backward. Once you can determine what those specific measures are, then I think you can start to figure out, okay, well, who's responsible for those things, right? Because the state is responsible for a portion, the district is responsible, and then the schools are responsible, but in very different ways. I think we also have to think about, once we get that definition, we have to think about two other components. What happens between the state, the district, and the school? So how healthy is that relationship? So for example, are states getting money out to districts and schools on time, so that it's available for them to use during the school year? But you also have to think about what's happening within each of those components of the system. So is the SEA, the state educational agency, as a system healthy? And then thinking about outwardly, is that entire system of relationship healthy between states, districts, and schools? Because then that's how you can start to figure out who is responsible for what within this broader thinking of accountability, this broader framework. There were a couple of points that David and Claire and Mike brought up that I did want to approach. And so one is thinking about this whole concept of unintended consequences, right? So we saw a lot of that under NCLB, namely the dumbing down of standards, right, and the assessment. So given the intense focus on tests and the performance on those tests and what happened to schools, there was a huge incentive for them to achievement standards, right? So what are those cut scores? And ultimately what happened is we saw lots of kids being proficient, but they were far below levels of what they needed to know to be ready for success in college and careers, as evidenced by our national remediation rates, right? Any given year, they're between 40 and 60%. That tells us that kids don't know what they need to know to be ready for college. The other unintended consequence that I don't think we talk about enough is that, under NCLB, states were actually required to create a unified system, not a federal system and a state system. But given the consequences around adequate yearly performance, it was 45 ways to fail, right? So if a school missed any one target on proficiency, on the other academic indicator, on graduation rates, for the 11 subgroups, they got dinged, and that started the school improvement timeline. So what incentive does a state have to include additional indicators? Because it's just more ways to fail, right? So states could really always do what they're now doing under the ESSA. There was just a huge disincentive to do so. So that's another, I think, unintended consequence that we really need to think about, is how federal policy has really stifled innovation when it comes to accountability. And so understandably, states might be approaching with caution. I know as a when I was a staff member at the U.S. Department of Education under the waivers era, it was quite an interesting phenomena where states were hesitant to think about innovating in their accountability system because they were so used to the system where it just told them that they were failing constantly. You know, on gaming measures, this concept, I think, is one also rampant under No Child Left Behind, and there's you know, present danger that we can kind of go in the same direction. You have to think about what happens when you include a measure, and probably one consideration that states really need to think about as they're considering this fifth indicator, as we call it, right, this other measure of school quality and student success. What type of behavior at the local level are they incenting by including that measure and tying consequences to it? David, you had mentioned the idea of, you know, test scores being a little bit squishy from year to year. They can bounce around, which we know is true. And so, you know, when it comes to growth, you know, Mike, as you know, states that do measure growth, they're including multiple years of data, so they are trying to correct for that issue. And so there might be, you know, ways that we can create much more stable measures when it comes to measuring test scores. You know, David, you also mentioned in the idea of looking at outcomes, looking at high school graduation, and you did get to the idea of the quality of the diploma mattering. It matters greatly. And it's not just when states have multiple diplomas, but even that single diploma. Is a high school diploma, I mean, let's all be honest with ourselves, is that diploma really meaningful to, especially to employers? Does it say that this student has a range of skills that are going to help them be successful in the workforce? Largely not, right? They're measuring academics, and that's pretty much me. You also raised the idea of looking at parent surveys. This is an interesting issue. As I'm at the Center for American Progress, many of my coworkers are parents of young children who are going to local DCPS and charter schools, and they're getting all of their reports right now. And it's interesting to see that there's a difference between how a parent perceives the school that his or her child is in and the objective measures of quality of that school. And so how do we correct for student or parent misperceptions of school quality? So I think we have to think really, really carefully about what parent surveys look like. And you also raised a point on, you know, the only way to measure 21st century skills is through surveys. I think there are other different ways. When I was the director of the College and Career Readiness and Success Center, we did work with a state in the Midwest who was interested in integrating 21st century skills with their college and career ready standards. And so we helped them through that process where they did a crosswalk of these skills to see what was the degree to which they were already integrated with the standards and where were the gaps. And they focused on the gaps. So how could they integrate much more tightly this broader range of skills so that through instruction, you are much more intentionally teaching these skills to students. So, and that's just one example of a way that we can just be a little bit more intentional about these skills. And certainly, you know, there are other ways to measure them. If you think about if students are doing work-based learning, you know, getting information from the employers on how students are reflecting the skills that are needed for success in that particular job. So there are just other ways like that. And then I think finally what I'd like to say is when it comes to what the ESSA is requiring of states, I do disagree a little bit with Mike. I do think that the draft regulations that were out, they require a school classification, right? So it says that schools have to be identified, and it's basically the bottom 5%, as either comprehensive support and intervention schools or targeted support and intervention schools. And those targeted support and intervention schools are those where particular student groups are performing at around the same level as those bottom 5%. And then over a number of years, those schools that have chronically underperforming schools also have to be identified. So those sort of three types of schools is how we interpret the regulations, what they mean when they say a single classification and not necessarily a letter grade. But when it comes to giving a summative classification for a school, there are certainly more ways to do that than an A to F letter grade. That's definitely one way. States can also design a system that is a matrix, right, that looks at two different degrees of performance. You could have achievement on one axis and growth on another. And for each indicator, you could give ratings along each of those. You could also do a business rules or a decision rules type of system where for any indicator, any set of indicators, a state could say, well, if a school meets this performance level then, and then just keep going down the road. So there are different ways to measure school performance and give that single classification. Again, it depends on what a state values and how they define college and career readiness. That's really where it all has to start for a state. So I will stop there.
Well, thanks for lots of fascinating points there. I really, take seriously this tension that you underscored between sort of a federal mandate around accountability and then local innovation. That's, we want both, but getting them both is harder than it sounds. We don't have a lot of time left, so David, I will ask you to be very concise and brief in responding to key points made by our guest, and then I want to go to our audience here and see if there are questions or comments. And I have one of my own before we wrap up. So David, why don't you respond?
I'm just going to respond to 3 points out of many in the interest of time. Laura, you mentioned the 5th measure that states can put in. My understanding of ESSA is a state could put in a 6th measure and a 7th measure
It's
if they
at least
like.
one.
So I just wanted to clarify that. You can, in addition to what they require, you can add at least one. And then a couple of points that Claire made. As I think you were saying, but correct me if I'm wrong, that you don't think having a dual system where districts do performance agreements with schools is a good idea.
Oh, no, I think that might be, I just don't see how you do that in a I think they're a great idea for, but I see them sort of separate apart from the baseline accountability
Yeah, well, I
system. I
agree.
think they're great as school improvement for a charter, absolutely fantastic. We just have to make sure you can still, a parent can still compare schools. We can still identify the failing ones. So
I think we agree.
I think both, yeah.
I think we agree because
Both and,
You need both.
but I need to
the
tweak.
statewide system I'm talking about with 5 or 6 elements and multiple indicators, that would apply to all schools except alternative schools. And that is the issue you raised is a real tough one. And I don't think it's fair to apply that system to every school. I mean, if a school is dealing with kids that are severely disabled or kids who've just come out of prison, can you really apply that same system? I think the solution I came up with was, yes, apply it, give them the grade, but their consequences actually come from a performance agreement with that school because they're so singular. Now, you have to avoid the problem you're talking about, where they label too many schools and programs alternative and put their worst kids in them, and so they avoid consequences. And I think the role there is for the state to audit, okay, what % of kids are in your alternative schools, and investigate if it gets above a certain number. And then finally, you said you guys are concerned about some of the softer measures that I'm advocating, and that would be things like the British inspection system and parent surveys, I assume. So let me just describe. You can visit schools. Like, has anybody here ever been to High Tech High in San Diego? Yeah, I mean, it's just a fantastic school. And the kids are motivated. It's a project-based learning school. or series of schools. It's now much more than one school. And the kids really get into these projects. But on test scores, you know, you look at their API, which is California's old measure, they look kind of mediocre. You know, they're a little below 800, which is the target for a good school in California, as I understand it. You just can't evaluate the quality of that school just through test scores. And I've been in so many other schools like that. Minnesota has a series of sort of teacher co-op schools where the teachers run the school, and most of them are project-based learning. And you go visit those schools, and you know, you have all kinds of kids from all walks of life that are really turned on by learning, and they're doing projects. And you know, you can't say this is not a successful school, but their test scores would say they are mediocre. Now, that's why I think that a system of evaluations by experts is really important, because they're going to see the quality that's not there when you just look at test scores. So that's sort of my defense of that approach.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, I agree that you do need a very simple system that rates all schools, because frankly, to identify those worst performing schools, do you need a ton of data? You really don't. You know which schools those are. But to get at how to improve teaching and learning, you need much more nuanced data. And an inspectorate model could be part of that. But I think it is, as Claire said, it's both and, it's not either or.
Right.
Well, just a point of clarification, David, on the, you know, sort of the school-specific performance plans. Obviously, this is a concept we have in the charter world, but you know, are district-run schools sufficiently different, you know, to warrant such plans? Are central school bureaucracies able to sort of negotiate good plans with them and then sort of make sure they enforce them? Or are you looking at alternative schools, you know, that are not going to be gradable under the minimal standards that all the schools have to apply to? Or are you arguing that all schools would benefit from being forced to sort of think about their mission, define it, and then organize a plan around it?
I think all schools would benefit. I think it's really, when you go out and visit cities and look at what their traditional schools are doing, we live in a world of change. I mean, the charter sector has sort of pushed the traditional sector to really diversify its offerings. You know, right here in DC, the district has something like 8 dual language immersion schools. And it's got all kinds of other models. So in the real world, yes, I think we now have a lot of diversity, much more than people realize, because you don't read about this in the newspaper, you know, or see it on the news. Secondly, let's talk about suburban districts where they may not have as much diversity. But those schools, the accountability system has no impact on them, because those kids, their parents went to college and they, you know, they perform well. They perform above the minimums. Why don't we want those schools also to set goals and be held accountable for improving the learning of their kids? Shouldn't we have a system that affects those schools as well? So I'm arguing let's do it for everybody. Yeah, and do we have the capacity in districts? Not yet. But let's not let that stop us. We can build it.
I agree, and I think a lot of suburban school districts suffer from the woebegone effect, where they think they're doing a lot better than they are. We had a question from a lady over here that you had asked to hold on.
Yeah.
But I didn't see whose hand. Was that
Yeah.
you? Would you please give us your name and question or comment?
Hi, I'm Valerie Brima. I am the executive director of a small charter school network in Los Angeles. I happen to be here for another event, so I appreciate the opportunity to be part of the conversation. There's so many things that I'd love to chat with all of you about, but I'm interested in the question of equity, which you raised a little bit. David, your slide, I think it was the 4th point about measures you would exclude, was where I sort of raised my hand. Because a lot of those measures, attendance, student retention, discipline rates, are where equity becomes most apparent, or the sources of inequity in the ultimate achievement scores. And so I know there's been a lot of work in California looking at disproportionality in discipline, in attendance rates, across subgroups, and that's something our charter school is very committed to studying And I'm a little bit concerned about states going down a path where we're not looking carefully at those things, because how kids are treated in the discipline system, it's not about just how many suspensions you have, but who's being suspended, expelled, at what rates, I think is so important. And on the other hand, I could see where you could say, well, ultimately that shows up in achievement scores, but I'm not totally convinced of that yet. So, and I do worry about this slippery slope, that if we say we're not going to hold schools accountable for these measures, and specifically for disproportionality within them, that we're not going to be, we're going to be demanding, and if kids can't handle it, they're out, and that's not really what public schools are here to do. So I just want to hear a little bit more about kind of your respective thoughts on that issue of equity and how we really capture that.
So in terms of discipline, let me address that one first. I think, and it's a difficult issue, right? How do we get it right? I think the best job has been done that I've seen by the charter board here in DC, where there was attention to high expulsion rates and suspension rates, and they said, okay, we're going to measure it, and we're going to publicize, and we're going to do these equity reports on every school, which show the rates, and they show them for every subgroup, racially and income and so on, English language learners, and everybody's got that data every year. And we're going to encourage schools to get the numbers down, but we're not going to set a target, and we're not going to punish them based on the numbers, because the only people who really know what they need to do to maximize learning at that school are the people who run the school. And from afar, we can't know that. And I just think that's profoundly true. And it's one of the reasons charters work so well, is that we do leave so many decisions up to the people who run the school. So I'm saying publicize, discuss it, jawbone, but, and the state should require that those things be measured and publicized, but don't set standards.
There are concerns, though, that to maximize learning, right, we're eliminating opportunities for kids who might make it a little hard for us to look good. And I think charter schools, I run charter schools, but I think charter schools have done that historically, some, and you know, so I worry about that too. It's like publicizing is one thing, but you know, I can bring those rates under control by counseling out kids. I'm not sure that's the desired outcome. So that's kind of what I'm trying to get to, is like, where does the accountability actually?
Yeah, and this is something that New Orleans really struggled with, and they came up with a solution where they have a standardized process for, is it just expulsion or suspension also?
It's voluntary transfer as well.
For voluntary transfer?
Yeah, in here for voluntary transfer.
But they also have somebody in the system for both the old system and the new, who's in charge of this process, and everything goes through them, all these transfers and expulsions, and I'm not sure about suspensions, I can't remember. But, so they're trying to get a handle on when bad behavior by the schools is taking place and intervene and create consequences, like not renewing charters, without, again, setting number targets that tie people's hands in ways that aren't constructive. So I think all those kinds of methods are important.
Hey, we unfortunately we're about to reach the witching hour here, but I know I've seen a couple of hands. So this gentleman here, does anybody else have an urgent question we could get to? Why don't we do 2 questions here and close it out? You first.
Yeah, thank you very much. Gary Ratner, Citizens for Effective Schools. Very much that was said, and you know, to explore. I'd like to focus on what seems to me sort of a central premise issue that Claire Voorhees raised. I think you said the purpose of accountability systems is to report to parents how students are doing, so parents can choose between schools. That was my sense of what you were saying. It seems to me that may have been the purpose under NCLB, but that ESSA, to a substantial extent, repudiated that by requiring that there has to be a school quality or student success measure included. And not only that, as you know, it basically repudiated the escalating sanctions the test focus driven and came up with a statute that is to help schools improve. And I do have a question specifically, and there are two programs. There's the comprehensive support program and the school-wide program. And they say specifically, you've got to reach out to shareholders, stakeholders, you've got to get collaboration, you've got to do needs analysis, you've got to come up with a comprehensive plan. There's a whole focus on a school improvement program. So this is my question. What would you think of a measure, a school quality measure that, for which there are examples, that would be a comprehensive school climate survey? It would go to students, staff, and parents, and it would focus on the key elements that need to be changed in low-achieving schools to turn them around. There is a specific one that I don't know if you're familiar with called the School Climate Assessment Inventory by California State University at Los Angeles, and I'd be interested in what you think of that, because that's a way of a very broad measure that gets into school improvement as well as just testing.
Thank you, Claire. Why don't you hold off for a second? Ma'am, do you still want to ask your question?
I was going to say that in all of these issues, I'm Susan Sclafani, one of the No Child Left Behind folks. I worry that in trying to implement these systems, we're not going to give the level of support to states and districts to do it well. The inspection system actually is much better in Scotland than in England. And when they did it in New York, they watered it down to maybe there was half a day of real inspection, very little feedback. So unless we're going to find some ways to support them, how are we going to expect any of these qualitative measures to make a difference?
Excellent, thank you. Great questions. Let me ask Claire to start, because you were asked a direct
Sure.
question, but then I'm going to ask everybody just to offer your final thoughts on either of those questions or anything else you'd like to offer before we close.
Yeah, so super quickly, yeah, I think, well, I mean, I think the purpose of an accountability system, just to clarify, is to make sure students are learning and are on track for college and career readiness. And the purpose of that is to inform policymakers, parents, for the purposes of choice, for the purposes of encouraging their school to increase. So I think it's much broader than just for school choice, just to clarify it. But on those indicators, I think it's so tough. This is the not ready for prime time, and I agree with David on this. I mean, school culture is so incredibly important, and I've worked at one of those where you walked in and you wanted to walk right out, and I've been a lot of charter schools where I wanted to drop my kids off right away. So I think that matters so much. I think there's so many technical problems with not problems, but issues that haven't been figured out around selection bias. Who's actually answering the survey? Around gaming, around the influence of parents by the school to influence the results, that I'm just not confident that those types of surveys are ready to be in an accountability system. Do I want them given and studied and reported on? Absolutely. And I think ESSA is a great opportunity to expand that definition, give states flexibility to expand that definition of accountability, but just be cautious about what actually goes into calculation, because of the nefarious and crazy things and the hiding of the ball that can happen when we put too much in that calculation. It kind of loses its meaning.
I think this gets super complicated, right? Anybody walking away from this today is probably like, oh my God, this is so complicated. We need some very clear thinking, okay? There's a set of activities that are around accountability, which is primarily about identifying low-performing schools and doing something about it urgently to help the kids in those schools. Would be great to do something also to reward excellent schools, okay? Separate whole set of activities around school improvement. What do we do to help schools get better? Both the low-performing ones, the mediocre ones, everybody, right? But those are two separate things, and that's going to take different kind of data and different kind of processes, okay? I think we also need to be very clear about the difference between having the goal of getting more kids to college and career readiness and then the right measures to hold schools accountable to. You will not find a stronger supporter of the Common Core. I have many bruises to prove it, and miles on my frequent flyer accounts going to state capitals, especially in the South, defending these damn things, okay?
So sorry.
And I am, yes, thank you. And I am, desperate that we keep those high standards that we fought for and those better tests, all right? But I think the number one way that we're going to fuel the unintended consequences again, to have states lower the bar again, is to once again say, and now we're going to have systems that expect 100% of kids to reach those standards. All right, right now, about 1/3 of kids graduate in America college and career ready, 1/3. For poor kids, it's maybe 10 or 20%. We are not going to get to 100%. Okay, certainly not in this generation. All right, that is sobering. I know I'm going to have my school reformer card taken away from me for saying that. Okay, but so we have got to. What we absolutely have got to focus on getting lots more kids to college and career readiness. But if you have a system that says to the Met high schools, where kids are coming in 3 grade levels behind, you're going to get an F unless 100% of your kids are college and career ready. They are going to get an F no matter what they do. And so I just want to make sure that for those of us who, for our friends who are advocating for things, saying, we got to have equity and we got to have high expectations. I understand that impulse. But if the system you're advocating for results in 100% of high poverty schools, including KIPP and Achievement First and Success and the Met and everybody else getting a failing grade, that is not a legitimate system. And I've looked at the math. I just think that's what's going to happen if we set unrealistic targets like that.
Um, I do think at heart it is an equity issue. We can't expect Mississippi to do for $7,000 per student what Massachusetts is doing with $14,000 per student, right? Can't do it. So we've got to ensure that all of our schools have adequate funding to get kids to that college and career readiness, that they all have access to highly effective teachers, to evidence-based supports that will get them to that bar. And until we can get to at least that basic level, then I agree with Mike that we're not going to get anywhere near the goal of 100% of students. I don't know that we should shy away from having that as a goal, right? We had the moon landing as a goal and we made it. So we can achieve the impossible, but until we look in the face that we have an incredibly inequitable system, then we're just not going to get there.
I agree with all of that. Basing public education funding on property taxes is just about the worst idea there is, and that's what 50 states do, right? So the courts keep telling them it's unconstitutional, and they keep creeping a little further along, but that is an important battle. But let me say 2 things to conclude. One is there's a whole lot more detail in this. So please pick up a copy on the way out if you don't have it. And it's not dense. It's pretty readable, I think. And 2, the key to what we're all trying to do, which is get all kids career and college ready, is the nature of the systems in which schools exist. The incentives that are given to them, the control they have over their own environment or lack of control, the choices that parents have. Funding is important. I would never say it's not, but it's actually not as important as the nature of the system in which schools exist. And we have inherited a system from 100 years ago, which was the best we could do at the time, but was built on the model called bureaucracy. And it doesn't work well in today's world. What works well in today's world is a system in which schools have a lot of autonomy to make their own decisions about how to spend their money, who to hire, who to fire, what kind of educational program to use, what kind of curriculum, how much technology, and all of those decisions, that schools make those decisions. Secondly, that they are accountable. And if the kids are not learning much, they don't survive forever. They get 5 years or however many years the state gives them, and then if the kids are not learning, they are replaced by a better school. Third, the parents have a choice. They don't have to go to this school or that school. And their choices include diverse kinds of models. So that, I have 4 kids and they're all adults now, but, at one point we had all 4 in different schools. Partly it was age and partly it was, they're different people, they learn differently. So we need different kinds of schools for different kind of kids, and you can't, if you're going to do that, you can't force kids to go to that different school. You got to give the parents choice. So that's part of the equation of what really works. And that package we now see in charter sectors that are run well by authorizers, and the result is the fastest improvement in the country in places like, or some of the fastest improvement places like New Orleans, DC, Denver, Indianapolis, and other places. And we should be learning from that. And that, to me, is the most important part of how we get where we all want to go.
Thanks, David. And finally, just because Mike mentioned this abysmal election, I think it is worth underscoring that this is one of those rare issues in Washington where there actually is some bipartisan synergy. I mean, both No Child and now ESSA have gotten support from both sides. So, you know, the Onion had a great headline, you know, President Obama, you know, signs bill to designate our last area of common ground in America. Well, this may be it, and we ought to cherish that thought as we endure the rest of this election. So with that, thank you for your patience, thank you for your great questions, and for coming today to our panelists for a really excellent discussion.